prior to that, the Vice Chair and I would have an opportunity to meet with Director Mueller to determine whether that fits within the scope of his current investigation, and we will do that.
Well, Mr. Chairman, the only thing I'm saying is that I know that you can tell by the intensity of the questions here that there's a lot of concerns right now, and we have both Director Coates and Admiral Rogers who are willing to say in a classified hearing that they would be able to answer differently. That's the only reason I was bringing that up, and we had it this afternoon. I would hope that would maybe be considered. Let me ask a question. Does the President support Section 702 reauthorization of the FISA and expanded authority?
Absolutely.
Everyone?
Full support.
Full support there. Did the President ask, or was he given any specific intelligence or info concerning the Russian active measures in the 2016 presidential election? Was he briefed on that? Did he ask for that briefing, or is it automatic briefing that you give? Admiral Rogers?
Well, all that took place before I was
So I will say, yes, he was briefed on the results of the intelligence community assessment. I was part of that in January prior to his assuming his duties. He and I have discussed as well the specifics of that assessment subsequent to him after he had become the president, assumed the duties.
Let me just say, just in finishing up, I just would hope that you all, with your expertise and all of your knowledge, would help us put closure to this sooner or later. I mean, we need your help. We need your assistance. We really do. And this is a committee that I think will take the facts as you give them to us and decipher that and come up with some appropriate action and a final report, which is, I think, what the public is looking for. We can't do that without your assistance. So thank you all.
And Senator, I fully understand that statement. And as the chairman mentioned, the procedures he's going to put in place relative to when we hold that hearing and the relationship it is to the official investigation that's going on by Director Mueller will dictate when and how we do that.
I think we need you in the skiff sooner than later. Thank you.
Senator Cotton.
Thank you, gentlemen. I want to talk about the import of Section 702 to our national security. Admiral Rogers, I'll direct most of these questions to you as the subject matter expert on the panel on signals intelligence from foreign threats, though I might turn to some of our lawyers for legal questions. Does Section 702, Admiral Rogers, allow you to collect information on U.S. citizens?
As intentionally targeted individuals?
Yes,
no.
intentionally target them.
No.
Does it allow you to target foreigners to do what's called reverse targeting of U.S. citizens, knowing those U.S. citizens are in communications?
No, it does not.
Does it allow you to collect information on foreigners who are on U.S. soil?
No.
It doesn't?
702 is outside the United States.
So you can collect information on an ISIS terrorist in Syria, and he comes to the United States, and you can no longer collect information on his cell phone or his email address.
We're a foreign intelligence organization. We coordinate with the FBI, but yes, sir, we don't do internal domestic collection broadly.
Mr. Rosenstein, do foreigners have constitutional rights?
When they're in the United States, Senator, different rules apply, and that's why I think it's important for people to understand that Section 702 applies only in circumstances where it's a foreign national outside the United States. If they're inside the United States, we would need to rely on other provisions of FISA to do that collection. So yes, we can do it, but we need to apply different rules. And Mr. McCabe, as the director indicated, is responsible for that.
Mr. McCabe, what happens when an ISIS terrorist comes from Syria to the United States and Director Rogers or Admiral Rogers can no longer use Section 702 to monitor his electronic communications?
Admiral Rogers folks notify mine, and then we work together to pursue coverage under different elements of the FISA statute.
I'm sure you'd work as hard as you can to make sure that it's absolutely seamless, but it does seem to me that Section 702, because it's limited to foreigners on foreign soil without targeting any U.S. persons anywhere, goes the extra mile to protect the constitutional rights of American citizens and even the supposed constitutional rights of foreigners when they come on U.S. soil. That's one reason why I support the permanent extension of Section 702, and I introduced legislation to that effect yesterday with the support of all 7 Republicans on this committee. Tom Bossert, the counterterrorism and homeland security advisor to the President, write in today's New York Times about our legislation. The Trump administration supports this bill without condition. Admiral Rogers, is that your position?
Could you repeat it again? I apologize, sir.
The Trump administration supports this bill without condition.
Yes.
On a scale of 1 to 10, how enthusiastic would you be if this bill passed? You can go over 10 if you would be excessively enthusiastic.
I would be ecstatic that we'd be in a position to continue to generate significant insights for this nation's security.
So you'd dial it straight up to 11?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Director Coates?
My level's about 100.
Mr. Rosenstein?
Senator, I'm not familiar with the rating system. I do think it's very important.
Director McCabe?
I'm at 11.
Director Coates, you had an exchange earlier with Senator Wyden about the efforts to estimate and declassify the number of persons who might be subject to incidental collection under Section 702. This is when you have a lawful 702 order, but someone does in fact communicate with an American citizen. It's my understanding that it would be virtually impossible to do so in a way that wouldn't further infringe on the rights of American citizens. Is that correct?
Well, yes, and that's one of the central reasons why I came to the conclusion. But the main reason I came to the conclusion is that is not conceivably possible. We could go through the procedures, we could shift hundreds of people to go over and breach the rights of hundreds, if not thousands, of American citizens to determine of individuals to determine whether or not they are American citizens or not. But we still, having done that, could not get to an accurate number, the number that Senator Wyden was trying to get us to. And my pledge to him is I would go out there, try to fully understand why it was we couldn't get that. There'll be detailed discussions on that on the closed session with the staff and the technicians from both NSA and from Senate staff here and others relative to all of the efforts that have been made to try to answer the question. And as I said in my statement, even if we were to take people off their regular jobs and say, get on this issue, even if we could put other measures in place, we still would not be able to come up. It's hard to explain how difficult this is or why this is the case, but that is what is going to be discussed in the closed session because all of this is classified information this afternoon. I assume the staff of members, all the members here will be there. But my pledge was to do the best I could to try to get to some answer. And the result was we couldn't get to an answer, number one. And number two, trying to get to an answer would totally disrupt the efforts of the agency. Now, if you might be able to make the case, let's hire 1,000 more people and get to the answer if you knew that you would get to the answer. Admiral Rogers has told me, I hope he doesn't mind me saying this, that if someone else out there knows how to get to it, he's welcome to have them come out and tell NSA how to do it. Well, but everybody says you can get to the number, it's easy, there's all kinds of agencies out there that can do it. I think you might welcome the advice if they wanted to do that. So it really raises the question of why there has to be an exact number.
Well, if we're going to hire 1,000 new people, I'd sooner them focus on terrorists and foreign intelligence services than violating the privacy rights of American citizens. My time has expired.
Senator Harris.
Thank you. Admiral Rogers, in response to the question from Senator Manchin, you, it appears, felt free to discuss the conversations you've had with the President in January about Russian active measures. Can you share with this committee how you're determining which conversations you can share and which you don't feel free to share?
Ma'am, the fact that we briefed the President previously, both went up to New York, and previously is a matter of public record.
So if it's a matter of public record, then you feel free to discuss those conversations?
If it's not classified, you can keep trying to trip me up. Senator, if you could I get to respond, please, ma'am?
No, sir. No.
Okay.
Are you saying that if it is classified, you will not discuss it? And then my follow-up question obviously would be, do you believe that discussion of Russian active measures is not the subject of classified information?
I stand by my previous comments.
Thank you. Mr. Rosenstein, when you appointed a special counsel on May 17th, you stated, quote, based upon the unique circumstances, the public interest requires me to place this investigation under the authority of a person who exercises a degree of independence from the normal chain of command. The order you issued along with that statement provides that 28 CFR 600.4 through 10 were applicable. Those are otherwise known as the special counsel regulations. Is that correct?
Yes, Senator.
And it states that the special counsel, quote, shall not be subject to the day-to-day supervision of any official of the department. However, the regulations permit you, as acting attorney general for this matter, to override Director Mueller's investigative and prosecutorial decisions under specified circumstances. Is that correct?
Yes, Senator.
And it also provides that you may fire or remove Director Mueller under specified circumstances. Is that correct?
Yes.
And you indicated in your statement that you chose a person who exercises a degree of independence, not full independence from the normal chain of command. So my question is this. In December of 2003, then Attorney General John Ashcroft recused himself from the investigation into the leak that led to the disclosure of Valerie Plame's identity as a CIA officer. The acting Attorney General at the time was Jim Comey. He appointed a special counsel, Patrick Fitzgerald, to take over the matter. In a letter dated December 30th of 2003, Mr. Comey wrote the following to Mr. Fitzgerald, quote, I direct you to exercise the authority as special counsel independent of the supervision or control of any officer of the department. In a subsequent letter dated February 6, 2004, Mr. Comey wrote to clarify the earlier letter stating that his delegation of authority to Mr. Fitzgerald was, quote, plenary. Moreover, it said that my, quote, conferral on you of the title of special counsel in this matter should not be misunderstood to suggest that your position and authorities are defined or limited by 28 CFR Part 600. Those are the special counsel regulations we discussed. So, would you agree, Mr. Rosenstein, to provide a letter to Director Mueller, similarly, providing that Director Mueller has the authority as special counsel, quote, independent of the supervision or control of any officer of the department, and ensure that Director Mueller has the authority that is plenary and not, quote, defined or limited by the special counsel regulations?
Senator, I'm very sensitive about time, and I'd like to have a very lengthy conversation and explain that all to you. I tried to do that.
Can you give me a yes or no answer,
in the closed
please?
briefing. Well, it's not a short answer, Senator. The answer
It is either you are willing to do that or not, as we have precedent in that regard.
But
Mr. Chairman, they should be allowed to answer the question.
It's a long question you pose, Senator, and I fully appreciate the import of your question, and I'll get to the answer. My quibble with you is Pat Fitzgerald is a very principled, very independent person. I have a lot of respect for him. Pat Fitzgerald could have been fired by the President because he was a United States attorney. Robert Mueller cannot because he's protected by those special counsel regulations. So although it's theoretically true that there are circumstances where he could be removed by the acting Attorney General, which for this case at this time is me, your assurance of his independence is Robert Mueller's integrity and Andy McCabe's integrity and my integrity and those regulations.
Sir, if I may, the greater assurance is not that you and I believe in Director Mueller's integrity, which I have no question about Mr. Mueller's integrity. It is that you would put in writing an indication based on your authority as the acting Attorney General that he has full independence in regards to the investigations that are before him. Are you willing or are you not willing to give him the authority to be fully independent of your ability statutorily and legally to fire him?
He has the
Yes or no, sir?
He has the full independence that is authorized by those regulations. And
Are
Senator,
you
as I
willing to
said,
do as has been done before?
With the senator suspend, the chair is going to exercise its right to allow the witnesses to answer the question, and the committee is on notice to provide the witnesses the courtesy, which has not been extended all the way across, extend the courtesy for questions to get answered.
Mr. Chairman, respespectly,
Mr. Rosenstein,
I would point out
will you-
that this witness has joked with the, as we all have,
The senator
his
will
ability to
suspend.
filibuster.
Mr. Rosenstein, would you like to thoroughly answer
Thank
the
you, Mr.
question?
Chairman. Senator, I'm not joking. The truth is, I have a lot of experience with these issues, and I could speak to you for a very long time about it, and I'm sympathetic. I appreciate the 5-minute limit. That's not my limit. But the answer is, This originated, as you may know, with the independent counsel statute. And I worked for an independent counsel, and I worked in the department during the independent counsel era when independent counsels were appointed by authorization of the Senate. They were appointed by federal judges, and they had essentially the authority equivalent to the Attorney General. That statute sunsetted, and the majority of members of this body concluded that that was appropriate because they did not want special independent counsels who were 100% independent of the Department of Justice. That was a determination made by the legislature. Now, I know the folks at the department who drafted this regulation under Janet Reno, and they drafted it to deal with this type of circumstance. And the idea was that there would be some circumstances where, because of unusual events, it was appropriate to appoint somebody from outside the department, not somebody like Pat Fitzgerald, who was a U.S. attorney who could be fired, but somebody from outside the department who could be trusted to conduct this investigation independently and could be given an appropriate degree of independence. Under the regulation, he has, I believe, adequate authority to conduct this investigation. And your ultimate check, Senator, is, number one, the integrity of the people involved in the investigation, but number two, the fact that if he were overruled or if he were fired, we would be required under the regulation to report to the Congress. And so I believe that's an appropriate check. And so I realize that theoretically anybody could be fired, and so there's a potential for undermining an investigation. I am confident, Senator, that Director Mueller, Mr. McCabe, and I, and anybody else who may fill those positions in the future will protect the integrity of that investigation. That's my commitment to you, and that's the guarantee that you and the American people have.
Senator
So
Cornyn.
is that a no?
Senator Cornyn.
Well, seems to be one thing we all agree on, at least so far based on the questions and the comments, and that is the 702 is an important tool for the intelligence community and one that needs to be preserved. And I agree with Senator Cotton that it should be extended without a sunset provision as currently written. So it's good to have one thing we agree on. But I want to ask Director Coates and perhaps Admiral Rogers if you want to comment on this as well. As I understand the framework of 702, it is to intentionally not target American citizens. It is to intentionally target foreign persons and to not collect information from American citizens except by way of incidental collection. And I think you've described, Admiral Rogers, the extensive procedures that the law requires and that NSA practices have in place to minimize the access of anybody in the intelligence community to that U.S. person. And indeed, you've talked about purging incidental collection that was made in the course of a 702 investigation. So it strikes me, Director Coates, the question that Senator Wyden has asked you and that's come up several times, to intentionally target American citizens in order to generate a number is just the opposite of what the structure of 702 provides, because the whole idea is to not collect, not to be able to gather information about American citizens except in the incidental course of collecting information against a foreign intelligence target. Is that a fair statement?
That's fair in my mind, and it was a central piece of the information of fact that caused me to come to the conclusion that this would do just exactly what you said. You're breaching someone's privacy to determine whether or not they are an American person.
To generate a list for Congress.
It potentially could, yes, to generate a list for Congress. That wasn't the only basis on which we made the decision, but that was an essential basis.
Thank you. I want to ask a little bit more about the minimization procedures and the importance of those, and a little bit about unmasking of U.S. persons' names that Admiral Rogers and others have, Director Coates, you've talked about. You've explained the process and the elaborate procedures that are in place to make sure that this is not done accidentally or casually. And I think that's very important to reassuring the American people that in the collection of foreign intelligence, we are extraordinarily protective of the privacy of U.S. citizens who might be incidentally collected against. And so, to me, the minimization procedures are very important. The internal policies of the NSA when it comes to collecting foreign intelligence that happens to incidentally impact American citizens is absolutely critical to this balance between security and individual privacy. Perhaps this is a question for Mr. Rosenstein, though, and maybe Director McCabe. If someone is to use the unmasking process for a political purpose, is that potentially a crime?
Yes, Senator.
And Director McCabe, perhaps, or Deputy Attorney General Rosenstein, for somebody to leak the name of an American citizen that is unmasked in the course of incidental collection, to leak that classified information, is that also potentially a crime?
Yes, I think that's the most significant point, Senator. I think it's important for people to understand unmasking is done in the course of ordinary, legitimate intelligence gathering, when the identity of the person on the other end of the phone, the other end of the message, may be relevant to understand the intelligence significance of the communication. Leaking is a completely different matter. Leaking is a crime. Disclosing information to somebody without a legitimate purpose, need to know that information, that will be prosecuted in appropriate circumstances. And there have been cases where we've been able to determine there's a willful violation of federal law, a disclosure that was not authorized, and prosecutions have been brought and will be brought.
And Mr. Rosenstein, not to pick on you or Director McCabe, but I think there's some confusion when we talk about generically about Russian investigations. We've described the role of the special counsel, which I think you've discussed in great detail, but that's primarily to investigate potential criminal acts and counterintelligence activities. Is it not?
The answer to that is yes. It is the idea of the Russian investigation that has much broader significance, I know, to many of you than the piece that Director McCabe and I are referring to, and the piece that Director Mueller is investigating.
Well, that's enormously helpful, at least to me, because when people speak generically of the Russian investigation, I think they're also including things like our responsibilities, the Intelligence Committee, to do oversight of the intelligence and of the potential countermeasures we might undertake to deal with the active measures campaign of the Russian government, which were clearly documented in the intelligence community assessment. But by my count, there are multiple committees of the United States Senate, including the Judiciary Committee on which I serve, which has different jurisdiction and oversight responsibilities. It's our job to do the investigation and write legislation. We're not the FBI. We're not the special counsel. We're not the Department of Justice. And I'm afraid in the conversation that we've been having here, people have been conflating all of those, and those are very distinct and importantly distinct functions. Thank you.
Senator Reid.
Oh, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Director McCabe, on May 11th, you testified, quote, Director Comey enjoyed broad support when the FBI and still does to this day, and then you added that you hold him in the absolute highest regard. Is still that the case?
It is, sir.
Thank you. Director McCabe, I'm trying to understand the rationale for your unwillingness to comment upon your conversations with Director Comey. First, you have had, I would presume, and correct me if I'm wrong, conversations with Mr. Mueller. You've had those conversations?
Yes, sir.
You're fully familiar with the scope of the investigation, since you've dealt with not only Mr. Mueller, but also with...
I am, sir, but I think it's important to note that Mr. Mueller and his team are currently in the process of determining what that scope is. And much in the way that Senator Cornyn just referred to, the FBI maintains a much broader responsibility to continue investigating issues relative to potential Russian counterintelligence activity and threats posed to us from our Russian adversaries. So determining exactly where those lanes in the road are, where does Director Mueller's scope overlap into our pre-existing and long-running Russian responsibilities is somewhat of a challenge at the moment, and that is why I'm trying to be particularly respectful of his efforts and not to take any steps that might compromise his investigation.
But getting back to your rationale for not commenting on the conversation between you and Mr. Comey, there's it seems to me that what you've said is that either that is part of a criminal investigation or likely to become part of a criminal investigation, the conversation between the President of the United States and Mr. Comey, and therefore you cannot properly comment on that. Is that accurate?
That's accurate, sir.
What about the conversations between Director Coates and Admiral Rogers with the President of the United States? Is that likely to become or is part of a ongoing criminal investigation?
I couldn't comment on that, sir. I'm not familiar with that, and it wouldn't be, for the same reasons it's not appropriate for me to comment on Director Comey's conversations, I certainly wouldn't comment on those that I'm further away from.
Mr. Rosenstein, are you aware of the possibility of an investigation, the conversations that Director Coates and Admiral Rogers have had with the President?
My familiarity with that, Senator, is limited to what I read in the newspaper this morning and what we heard here today.
Okay. Director Coates, have you had any contact with the Special Prosecutor or any...
I have not.
Have you been advised by any of your counsels, or private or public, that this conversation that you had with the President could be subject to a criminal investigation?
I have not.
Admiral Rogers, same question.
To the last question, no, I have not.
Let me just return again to the points that I think Senator King made very well, which is this unwillingness to comment on the conversation with the President, but to characterize it in a way that you didn't feel pressured, yet refusing to answer a very specific and non-intelligence-related issue. I don't see how it would impact on the classification and our status, whether or not you were specifically asked by the President to do anything. Do you still maintain that you can't comment on whether you're asked or not?
Nothing has changed since the initial response.
I stand by my previous answer.
I just must say that the impression I have is that if you could say that, you would say that. Thank you. I have no further questions.
Senator McCain.
Well, gentlemen, you're here at an interesting time. It's funny how sometimes events run together. This morning's Washington Post, top intelligence official told associates Trump asked him if he could intervene with Comey on FBI Russia probe. It goes into some detail. I'm sure you've read the article, and it's more than disturbing, obviously, if it's true that the President of the United States was trying to get the Director of National Intelligence and others to abandon an investigation into Russian involvement. It's pretty serious. I also understand the position that you're in, because it is classified information, and yet here it is on this morning's Washington Post in some detail. I'm sure you've read it. So I guess if I understand you right, Director Coates, is that in a closed session you are more than ready to discuss this situation. Is that correct?
I would hope we'd have the opportunity to do that.
Well, I hope we can provide you with that opportunity. You know, it's just shows what kind of an Orwellian existence that we live in. I mean, it's detailed, as you know from reading the story, as to when you met, what you discussed, et cetera, and yet here in a public hearing before the American people, we can't talk about what was described in detail in this morning's Washington Post. Do you want to comment on that, Dan?
Are you asking me? Comment on the integrity of the Washington Post reporting? I guess I've been around town long.
It's pretty detailed.
I guess I've been around town long enough to say, not take everything at face value that's printed in the Post. I served on the committee here and often saw that the information that we had been discussed had been reported, but that wasn't always accurate. But I think this is the response that I gave to the Post was that I did not want to publicly share what I thought were private conversations with the President of the United States. Most of them, almost all of them, intelligence related and classified. I didn't think it was appropriate to do so in an open, for the Post to report what it reported or do that in an open session.
Well, it's an unfortunate situation that you're sitting there because it's classified information, and this morning's Washington Post describes in some detail, not just outline, but times and dates and subjects that are being discussed. And I'm certainly not blaming you, but it certainly is an interesting town in which we exist.
Yeah, just because it's published in the Washington Post doesn't mean it's now unclassified.
But unfortunately, whether it's classified or not, it's now out to the world, which is obviously not your fault, but describes dates and times and who met with who. And so, well, do you want to tell us any more about the Russian involvement in our election that we don't already know from reading the Washington Post?
I don't think that's a position that I'm in. I do know that there are ongoing investigations. I do know that we continue to provide all the relevant intelligence we have to enable those investigations to be carried out with integrity and with knowledge.
Well, it must be a bit frustrating to you in protecting what is clearly sensitive information and then to read all about it in the Washington Post. You have my sympathy, and I expressed that at your confirmation hearing, doubting your sanity. So, Admiral, you got anything to say about it?
No, sir, other than, boy, some days I sure wish I was an ensign on the bridge of that destroyer again.
I can understand that. I feel the same way. Mr. Rosenstein.
Senator, I can't speak for anybody else, but I'm proud to be here. I'm proud to be here with Director McCabe, and I'm sure he feels the same way.
I do.
Whatever that might mean. Thank you, Mr. Chief.
Thank you, Senator McCain. The chair is going to recognize Senator Wyden for one question on 702.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the courtesy. This one, Director Coates, I'd like a yes or no answer on. Can the government use FISA Act Section 702 to collect communications it knows are entirely domestic?
Not to my knowledge. It would be against the law.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Warner.
Again, I want to thank all the witnesses, but I come out of this hearing with more questions than when I went in. Gentlemen, you were both willing to somehow characterize your conversations with the President, that you didn't feel pressure, but you wouldn't share the content. In the case of Admiral Rogers, we will have an independent third party that will at least provide some level of contemporaneous description of that conversation, and obviously why there was concerns enough to commit that to writing. I'm pretty frustrated that there is this deference to the special prosecutor, even though the special prosecutor has not talked to you. I'm concerned with the Deputy Attorney General, also deference to the special prosecutor, but there doesn't seem to be, and this committee and the chairman and I are committed to making sure that we appropriately deconflict. What we don't seem to have is the same commitment to find out whether the President of the United States tried to intervene directly with leaders of our intelligence community and ask them to back off or downplay. You've testified to your feelings response. Candidly, your feelings response is important, But the content of his communication with you is absolutely critical. And I guess I would just say, the president's not above the law. If the president intervenes in a conversation and intervenes in an investigation like that, would that not be subject of some concern, Mr. Rosenstein?
Senator, if anybody obstructs a federal investigation, it would be a subject of concern. I don't care who they are. And I can commit to you, if you're looking for commitment from Mr. McCabe and from me, that if there is any credible allegation that anybody seeks to obstruct a federal investigation, it will be investigated appropriately, whether it's by Mr. McCabe, by me, by the special counsel. That's our responsibility, and we'll see to it.
Well, I thank the chairman for the fact that we've been working on this in a bipartisan way, and we will ultimately have to get to the content of those conversations. Thank you.
Director Coates, I know you've got to go. Give me 90 more seconds, if I could. And this question probably to you, Admiral Rogers. Have our partners globally used 702 intelligence to stop a terrorist attack?
Yes, sir. And if we were to lose a 702 authority, I would fully expect leaders from some of our closest allies to put out one loud scream.
And in most cases, didn't they take credit for our intelligence?
They don't publicly talk about where it comes from, but we acknowledge NSA is a primary provider of insights.
I just wanted to get on the record.
Yes, sir. A host of nations.
This is a global asset.
Yes.
That the war on terror has is 702.
Sir.
Now,
Mr. Chairman, if I could just take
yes, sir.
the time you were trying to protect for me for my next appointment, to just say following, and I just want to repeat, following my interaction with my contemporaries in a number of European countries, they are deeply, deeply grateful to us for the information derived from 702 has saved what they said literally hundreds of lives.
Well, certainly the committee is privy to those instances in a lot of cases, and we're grateful for that. And gentlemen, I want to thank you for your testimony. But before we adjourn, I would ask each of you to take a message back to the administration. You're in positions whereby you're required to keep this committee fully and currently informed of intelligence activities. In cases where the sensitivity of those activities would not be appropriate for the full committee or open session, there's a mechanism that you may use to brief the appropriate parties. It's sometimes often referred to as the Gang of Eight notification briefing, and I think without exception, everybody at the table has utilized that tool before. Congressional oversight of the intelligence activities of our government is necessary, and it must be robust. Thus, the provisions of this unique briefing mechanism, given the availability of that sensitive briefing avenue, at no time should you be in a position where you come to Congress without an answer. It may be in a different format, but the requirements of our oversight duties and your agencies demand it. With that, again, I thank you for being here. This hearing's adjourned.
And we've been watching this live now. President Trump's national intelligence team on the hot seat on Capitol Hill, and there have been some rather fiery moments in just the last hour of this. Note the timing, too. We are less than 24 hours before the high-stakes testimony from fired FBI Director James Comey is set to begin, and that came up a lot during this. This is Outnumbered. I'm Harris Faulkner. Here today, Sandra Smith, Meghan McCain, Rachel Campos Duffy, today's #OneLuckyGuy, Washington Times opinion editor and Fox News contributor Charlie Hurt is outnumbered. That was interesting. I want to get your opening thoughts on just how we didn't talk about FISA, the Foreign Intelligence Security Act that they were going to talk about renewing. We did talk a lot about James Comey, the president.
Yeah, this is exactly why America hates Washington.
Yeah.
And
this is why.
And it's why Donald Trump is president, because, you know, here they came together to talk about something that is vitally important, that touches on everything.
And they got nowhere.
And they got nowhere, and it devolved into a political, you know, food fight, and that's all it was, and they accomplished nothing. And you know, as you said, so are we going to renew it or not? You know,
Right, but that was in like 2.5 hours in. I said that because they hadn't talked about it
as a joke.
Yeah, I was kidding. But look, they adjourned. Now, they do have a private session that you heard everybody talking about behind closed doors coming up at 2 p.m. Eastern. Director of National Intelligence Dan Coats and NSA Director Mike Rogers among the officials testifying before Congress today. The hearing is supposed to be, as we talked about, focused on surveillance powers, but the topic that was really getting all the attention, a new Washington Post report which claims President Trump pressured Coats in March to try to convince Comey to back off former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn in his Russia investigation. That report also claims the president then asked both Coats and Rogers to publicly deny any evidence of collusion between his campaign and the Russian government. But both officials deny ever feeling pressure to act inappropriately. Here's a touch.
To the best of my recollection, I have never been directed to do anything I believe to be illegal, immoral, unethical, or inappropriate. And to the best of my recollection, during that same period of service, I do not recall ever feeling pressured to do so.
I have never been pressured. I have never felt pressure to intervene or interfere in any way and shaping intelligence in a political way.
You may not have felt pressure, but if he's even asking, to me, that is a very relevant piece of information.
So, Sandra, you made a comment during this that, okay, so we are far afield from the original conversation, but we also have something else going on. They're not going to answer these questions in public. And they said it like how many times?
No, and to quote Coates over and over again, quote, I do not share with the general public conversations that I have with the president. Going back to Charlie's point about not getting much out of this other than the headline is dysfunction in Washington. I mean, there's really no big news coming out of this otherwise just confirming what we already knew.
Yeah, and Senator Warner tried to make a joke at or sort of make fun of them for talking about feeling pressure, not feeling pressure. They said they didn't feel pressure. Well, whether you felt pressure is the definition of whether there was obstruction of justice or not. If the president said to them, "Hey, just knock off this thing. There's nothing here." If he said that, but they didn't feel pressure, then there was an obstruction of justice. If there was obstruction of justice, I think we would probably know it because, first of all, there would be they would have reported it. They would have been obligated to report it. And we've heard from both Democrats and Republicans who have said that they have not that in private settings they have not been told that the president is under investigation.
Can we talk a minute about the acrimony that was going on in the room? Because it got kind of uncomfortable at one point. Senator Kamala Harris in California was kind of pressing, trying to get the chiefs, the intel chiefs, to answer questions, and they clearly were saying, we're not going to talk about that. That was classified information with the president. Well, if it's not classified, are you going to talk about it? Rachel, it got a little interesting. And again, that's not really the focus of today.
Right, just like when she interviewed CIA Director Pompeo when he was up for his nomination to the job, and she asked him about climate change. This is the new CIA director, and I mean, she's always off topic. She's just, you know, trying to make a political statement. I think what's interesting about all of this, you know, I live in Wisconsin. This month is Dairy Month. I've been at many dairy breakfasts.
Every month is Dairy Month in Wisconsin.
Best cheese on the planet.
Breakfast month, and so every county has a breakfast. We go to a lot of these as a political family. No one is talking about any of this. I know it might be really hard for people in D.C. and New York to figure this out, but I know they're pushing the Comey thing tomorrow. Nobody asked us about that. You know what people asked us about? Are you going to pass health care? Are you going to do tax reform? That's where the American people are at. My goodness. Well, I think this has got to be helped.
Or is my kid going to get a job when he graduates college?
So you're really onto something there. So at 12:55 Eastern, so in just a few minutes, the president is expected to, in Cincinnati on the tarmac perhaps, talk about health care just for a couple minutes before he talks infrastructure in Ohio today. There are a lot of other things to talk about. This is a shiny object in Washington, preambling the other shiny object with James Comey tomorrow. What are your thoughts?
Well, I completely agree with what Rachel's saying, that I don't think the average American, I think they're so tuned out at this point. We now have the Washington Post saying one thing, and then Dan Coats and NSA Director Rogers saying something completely different. So first and foremost, I want to know who these sources are that the Washington Post continues to keep speaking to, because if they just lied under oath, obviously they could go to jail for that. I don't believe they just did. So who are you talking to, Washington Post? And there's a reason why the average American has lost complete and total faith in journalists as a collective whole. There's so much information coming out everywhere. At the end of the day, people like me just want to know, did the Trump campaign have anything to do with Russia, colluding with them at any point in time? The fact that there's so much politicizing and talking points me in the direction that it's most likely not, because if you have a smoking gun, it probably would have opened up by now.
Well, Senator Warner has said this, Democrat, there is no smoking gun.
Yeah.
And I'm quoting him. So what are they all looking for? Like, what are they on the floor crawling around looking for if it's not the smoking gun?
Executive privilege came up in the hearing. I think we all heard that. Here was the exchange. Let's listen.
Is there an invocation by the President of the United States of executive privilege? Is there or not?
Not that I'm aware of.
Then why are you not answering
Because
our
I feel
questions?
it is inappropriate, Senator.
What you feel isn't relevant, Admiral. What you feel isn't the answer. The answer is, why are you not answering the questions? Is it an invocation of executive privilege? If there is, then let's know about it. If there isn't, answer the questions.
I stand by the comments I've made. I'm not interested in repeating myself, sir.
Megan, you were having a
I
strong
love that.
reaction.
Well, I think Angus King is so entertaining anyway, but just saying your feelings don't matter. With my mom chastising me when I was a middle schooler about what's going on. And I think it's the point you're making. We're learning nothing from all of this. Politicians on both sides are grandstanding for the cameras because they want to go home to their constituents and say, look, I'm fighting for X agenda. We're learning nothing. I have very little faith we're going to learn anything tomorrow with the Comey hearings as well. I think that we probably know everything that he's going to say already. I don't know he's already testified, exactly. I don't know what the end goal is here, again, other than what I said. Did President Trump put pressure on Comey to lay off the investigation? Yes, the investigation of General Flynn.
Something bigger, though. I mean, I think the answer to your question, why are they doing this, if we already heard from both these witnesses and Comey himself saying that they didn't feel pressured, the reason they're doing this is they think that they can stop the Trump agenda. They want to do anything they can to gum up the political wheels and stop the Republicans from doing what they have promised their people that they were going to do. That's what this is about.
And yeah, but it's not working for them this week because the president actually
is working.
Well, but look at what the president has been doing this week, though. I mean, we saw movement on an issue with the Veterans Affairs that people like my dad, who are veterans, have been waiting for years for there to be movement. That doesn't get covered in some of the mainstream media, but it is in fact happening.
Tomorrow we're going to have all four networks live in the Comey hearings. I'm sorry, whatever we're trying to do with repeal and replace right now is the agenda has been hijacked at the moment. And I'm sorry, to sit here and say different, I think is disingenuous. Tomorrow, it may last a week, but they can't do this forever.
Yeah, but putting those policies into place may not get talked about, and I agree with you wholeheartedly, and it may not get talked about tomorrow at all. But the policy's in place. The president signing executive orders about things, those will be in place. The talks today about a $1 trillion infrastructure legislation, that will be in place. Real quick, your thought. You got a thought bubble on.
Yeah, the theatrics of this versus President Trump out in America talking about health care. If you want to kick off a re-election campaign, this is the week to do it.
That's right.
Oh, interesting. Okay, so as a preamble to James Comey, we're going to talk about what we do expect to come up tomorrow. And remember, that one has a public-private session, too, just like today's. Very interesting. What do you think you'll see and hear in public from James Comey? We know that Megan likes to say that he's a bit of a
show pony.
Yes, we're coming right back.